Welcome back to the podcast for small businesses. Today, me and Mike have compiled a list of 5 different things of the biggest mistakes we see companies make. First of all, it's spending money in the wrong place. Secondly, lack of temperament and not having foresight, not being able to see into the future, being afraid of spending money and then borrowing money too soon. And let's take it from the bottom. So, borrowing money too soon, Mike. Why is that such a
Classic
big?
mistake.
Because I hear a bunch of stuff about borrowing money, especially in the US, is a very good idea.
When you borrow money, you owe that money back to the person from whom you borrowed it. And that person is known as a creditor. They extended credit to you by giving you money. You can go two ways with that. You can refuse to pay it back and destroy whatever the relationship may have been before. It will never recover if you don't pay it back. Even worse, you sign a contract and you owe an interest amount of interest on it, and that just keeps compounding over time. Borrowing money too soon injects a ton of stress into your life you don't need. And many times I've seen early stage companies go out and borrow money, but they don't have an identified use for it. They just want to have it to have it. And before you borrow money, you better have somewhere it's going to go. Where's it going to get allocated? What's it going to do for you that's worth the cost of borrowing?
So, what are some of the things to look at? Now, you mentioned that looking at is it worth actually borrowing? How do you make sure it's worth borrowing? Like, what are some of the things that a small business owner could go out and do?
Well, so you don't borrow money because you're running out of cash. If you're running out of cash, it's because you've planned something incorrectly or your estimates are off somewhere and you need to regroup a little bit. You should always have a little bit of a cash cushion to get you through those emergency periods. You should not borrow money to get through an emergency because what you're really doing is borrowing money and spending it as soon as you get it, and you're not doing anything to help the business grow. Things you want to look at is what's the interest rate? How is that compounded? If it's a yearly, what they call an annual percentage rate, that's fine, but pay attention. If you miss 1 month's payment, you all of a sudden owe a bunch of extra fees because of that. So look at the interest rate and the structure of the loan. Also look at what you're going to do with the money. We've already alluded to that.
For sure.
And look at what return are you going to get when you deploy that money. So if I borrow $100,000 and I know that where I'm going to deploy that money, I can get a return on my business of around 8%, then my cost of borrowing needs to be less than 8%. So if I
Mm,
can't borrow it for 8% or less, I'm going to lose money by borrowing. So I won't borrow. This is
exactly.
something you look at.
Exactly.
Also, look very deeply at your own personality. Are you borrowing because you're scared, frightened, desperate? Or are you borrowing because you have a good temperament, you've thought this through, and you have a plan to pay this money back?
Very
Those are
good
the things you
pointers,
look
Mike.
at.
Very good pointers, Mike. And we won't go too much into the math of how to calculate to borrow money because it's going to bore most people listening to this. If it's something you need help with, feel free to check the link out down below and reach out to us and book a free 30-minute free session and we can sort that shit out. The second thing on the list is being afraid to spending money. And the reason why this is on the list is basically if you're just sitting on a bunch of cash, ain't doing nothing with it, you are more or less losing money. Of course, you want to have a cushion like you do in a normal life. You don't want to run it so lean that you go bankrupt. Sometimes you have to take big risks if you really want to grow. And then either you go bankrupt, you don't. But at least then you're doing something with it. The one thing about not doing anything is you're guaranteeing that nothing's new, nothing's better is going to happen. If you experience growth, that's because you're lucky. You had a good season, a good quarter, but it's not something you can expect next year. And somebody else is going to come in and take your space, especially if there's seeing growth in that sector. So, Mike, what is some of the reasons would you say? Actually, I'm curious as to why business owners are afraid of spending money because I can always find a new opportunity to spend money in a good way.
You just nailed it, Moss. The reason so many of the business owners that I've worked with and invested in have been afraid to spend money is exactly that. They don't see the benefit or the value of spending the money, but they think they're doing okay. And when in reality, doing okay simply means they happen to be getting lucky in their market. The truth is, in order to grow your revenues, you need to be spending money on certain things. That can vary from business to business. In general, it's going to be things like more training for you and your staff. It's going to be more advertising, marketing, these kinds of things, building an audience. You need to spend money on these sorts of things or you're not going to grow very well.
At least not very fast.
No. And it comes down to fear and arrogance. And fear and arrogance are flip sides of the same coin. Sometimes people are genuinely afraid if I spend that money, then I won't have it. And what if that training doesn't help me? Or what if this marketing thing doesn't help me? Then that money's gone. That's true. There's always risk.
Yes.
If you can't handle risk, don't run a company. Now, fear is healthy when you use it correctly and ask the right kinds of questions. The flip side of the coin is arrogance. Arrogance kills a lot of companies, and we can name them, sit here all day long naming companies that used to be big that no longer exist. You can't afford to be arrogant. And we see it all the time. And it's gotten to the point where in our investments, if we see managers becoming arrogant within a company, we pull our assets out. We're just like, we don't want to invest in arrogant management teams. We just won't.
Ah, very.
Arrogance kills morale, it kills motivation, and eventually kills the company.
Arrogance is very dangerous. Sometimes people
Yes.
have a hard time differentiating between confidence and arrogance. Basically, the
But
difference is you have evidence for one of them and you don't have evidence for the other.
exactly.
So ask
I
the right
love to use
kind of
this
questions,
example.
as you mentioned,
Yeah,
Mike.
this example, folks. If you're thinking about taking a class from somebody who's supposed to be a super excellent business guru, the arrogant person will say, I don't need that.
That's a
But the
dangerous
person that
thing to
has a
say.
little bit of fear and recognizes they have a little bit of fear will say, I don't think I need that, but let me investigate. Does this person have references I can call and talk to? Does he have former people that have taken his course and can tell me what it was like? That's the difference between fear and arrogance when it comes to picking, that kind of course as an example. So as you said, Moss, go for the evidence.
I think that's another thing when it comes to as a first thing on the list is not having foresight. Not being able to look into the future. I think that goes very much into having the evidence because watching Shark Tank, and you probably experienced this in helping companies getting capital, is people make up some crazy numbers. They
Oh
are on
yeah.
some heavy kind of stuff when they're doing accounting. What are some of the funny
So
things you've seen when it comes to the numbers?
people trying to pretend that they have a crystal ball and they can predict the future. Everybody knows that's impossible. And yet some funny things I've seen. I've seen people come into meetings with sales projections. By year two, we'll be here. By year three, we'll be here. But it's just kind of this straight line up at an angle. It's like no business runs that way. There's ups and downs. It's a very bumpy ride. It's not a straight line.
No, not at all.
That one, that one always cracks me up. What we had more recently that just still causes me to chuckle is, well, our company's backed by Bitcoin or Ethereum or
What?
Mysterium or the
What?
X-Men or yeah, people come up with all these kinds of things that aren't real assets. For example, cryptocurrency is not a hard asset. It has value because other people are willing to pay for it. That does not make it a hard asset. So if you come and do an investor pitch with me and my group and you say, well, we're backed by Bitcoin, I say, great. Do you have any actual assets? That's a silly mistake I see people do.
No,
Another one is
Mike
the
don't like crypto. If you didn't notice, Mike doesn't like crypto.
for me.
Yeah,
It may be a
exactly.
great investment for someone else, but it's not for me. Another one, funny one I've seen so many times is the co-founders doing a pitch together. And it's two people who want you to believe that they're in sync on everything. And you're like, well, unless one of you's a clone of the other one, there's going to be times when you're not in sync. So don't give us this baloney story about how you agree on everything at all times. What we want to hear is, how are you going to deal with disagreements? How have you dealt with them in the past? Because they will happen. Those are a few funny examples. I would have to say my funniest, though, classic example. When I was in the rocket business, there's a well known, formerly very large defense company that swore up, down, left, right, center, backwards, and forwards that they were never going to get involved with a certain navigation technology. So I went to work for another company that wanted to make that technology happen. And that second company made a fortune. 12 guys on that team produced $1 billion in business within 3 years. Why? Why did that first company tell us they would never, ever, ever, ever do this kind of tech? They didn't have the vision for it. That's why. And they weren't willing to think that a bunch of young punks knew anything. So there's your arrogance factor coming back in. But yeah, pretty funny stuff happening in business all the time. And as I like to say, if it wasn't for people making these dumb decisions, I wouldn't make so much money. So I'm glad for the I'm glad for the short-sighted people.
Should we take a moment of silence as a thank you for them? Is that what are you saying?
Sure,
Ah,
why not?
ah. Yeah, those crack me up. The last one was like, how the fuck how is this going to be relevant? But you circle it back around, and then I thought, is this one of Mike's stories that's just gonna go on? I think lack of foresight goes very well with lack of temperament as well, which is the
Yes.
fourth thing. Because if you have a clear vision of what you want to do, and then like a small thing goes wrong, then it's not as big of a deal as if you're making every project like a big thing. Then all of a
Yes.
sudden you're very easily get annoyed, you very easily get stressed. Sometimes you want to have to downplay things. I think that's contrary to what you want to do with your goals, as we spoke about. You don't want to like come up with some crazy numbers to investors, but to yourself, do that. But going back to lack of
Yes.
temperament, what is it for you that made you want it on this list, Mike?
I started this company to help people. That's my motivator. And I happen to do that by helping people grow their businesses. Lack of temperament kills companies in a couple of very vicious and insidious meaning it's happening kind of under the surface. And sometimes you won't notice it till it's too late. But it does some insidious ways of destroying a company. If you, as the leader of the company, don't have the kind of temperament where you would rather be kind to someone than screw them over, people will stop trusting you, and they'll stop trusting you pretty quickly. And then they'll stop telling you things you need to hear. And then you'll start getting blindsided, and then you'll be wondering what happened. So temperament's super important. So kindness is important. And I'm not talking about stupid, ethereal, head in the clouds kindness. I'm not talking about unaware kindness. I'm talking about being kind can even be, hey, you know, buddy, you messed up this project, and we're going to have a postmortem to examine what went wrong and what you can do to fix it and recover. That's an act of kindness as opposed to firing a person. So that's the kind of kindness I'm talking about, is things that move your company in a positive direction. Temperament will also drive you crazy if you're too high strung. If you're a control freak, if you're a micromanager, you're going to be up late at night worrying about all kinds of stuff. Why did you hire people to help you if you can't sleep at night? Right?
True.
Like you hired them so you could sleep.
Yeah, you're
So,
able to have time off, stuff like that. Some that's nice sometimes, believe it or not.
yeah, exactly. You also have to have the kind of temperament that knows. intuitively that you will get ripped off. If you're going to be in business, there will be times when people don't pay their contracts. There'll be times when, sadly, someone working for you screws you over and they have to be fired. I mean, these things will happen. When they happen, instead of getting upset and dwelling on it and carrying all that pain for years and years, like so many people do, you have to develop the temperament to say, all right, well, that happened. I knew something was going to happen at some point. So here it is. So do what you can do and move on, because you've already established in your brain something's going to go on sometime, even though you don't know what. Then when it does happen, you're prepared to let it go.
Yeah,
So these
nothing.
temperaments are all super important.
Like realize things could be worse. Somebody could be dead.
Oh yeah,
There's
yeah,
much worse things in the world than losing a bit of money. It sucks in the moment, yes, of course it does, but don't lose sleep over it. I like to switch it around, and that's, I think, sometimes for me that makes it easier to deal with very bad things compared to just like a small bad thing. Is for me it's easier to switch that around and push that into motivation.
yes.
Like
It
switching
should be
that
motivational.
yeah, like there's always something good to be had, and I think that goes into to having a good temperament, not being too serious, not being. We all have can imagine that, like imagine working at a regular 9 to 5, and like that old school boss comes in. I say boss and not manager for a good reason, and everything just have to be immaculate. Like he's checking behind the radiators, everything just, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, like, what's the point? What's the point? You just,
Yeah, it's intimidation. They
yeah,
try to
exactly.
intimidate, and it's
And that's not the feelings you want to give the people you work with or work around you or have worked for you or however you want to put it. Right? Make people
and
feel
if
wanted is a
yeah,
good idea, I would say.
one of my favorite investing research tricks when I'm investigating and thinking about and analyzing a company that we might want to invest in, I go visit their site and I don't announce myself. I don't come in the big fancy suit. I just I go somewhere that I can use their product in person, whatever it is they're selling. And I go there and I pay attention to several things. Now, usually through body language, you can pretty well pick out who the leaders are. Whether they have titles or not is another matter, but you can see the leaders through their body language. But I look and see if they're sitting eating lunch, do they pick up their own crap or do they leave it on the table? You know, if the leaders in a company aren't picking up their own trash, they want somebody else to do it, I'm probably not investing with them. I'm looking for how do they speak to people. Here in Austin, it's really easy. There's a couple coffee shops that are right next to centers where there's a bunch of big companies clustered. So people will go to these coffee shops and I listen. I pay attention. How are they talking to the people pouring the coffee? Are they calling them by name? Are they being nice? Are they being kind? Or are they just like, give me a blah, blah, blah coffee? You know, how are they acting? So this is a really good edge when you're looking for help for your company too. Figure out where people hang out that you might want to hire. Go there and just observe. You can learn a lot by watching people.
Yes. Being in the right kind of places. What leads me on to the fifth biggest mistake we see in business. That's spending money in the wrong place.
Yes.
And we kind of
Yes.
covered like the introductionary points to it with actually going to the right people, doing your research. That's of course crucial. But how do you find the right place to spend your money? Do I think is a better question to ask. So I want to hear your answer to that question, Mike.
I use investing rules for this. So we will have a training budget. As an example, I'll use the example of hiring people for training us, or courses we may want to take. So we have a budget for that. Now, about 10% of that budget, I figure, is wasted money. We hired the wrong course, we took the wrong seminar. So we already built in a little bit that we just know we're going to make some mistakes picking the right thing. So what happens then I'll use the example of like a week long seminar. If we go to this week long seminar and day 2 or 3, I figure out this is not helping us, we leave. And that's part of that 10% we had allocated, right? So that's part of it. That's part of it. Don't invest good time after bad. If it turns out to be a bunch of horse hockey, then just don't keep sniffing the fumes. Get out of there.
Never heard that example before.
It's old Texas saying. Um, so, how do you know if spending money's worth it? It's a calculated risk. What is the return you expect? So, again, the example of a week long seminar. What do we expect to gain from this that we're going to be able to add to our business's bottom line? And how long will that take? If we're taking a seminar on how to do better marketing, great. What can we reasonably expect? Well, I'll ask those questions of the seminar giver before we sign up. I will call them, and I think everybody should do this. Call them and say, "Hey, seminar giver person, what could be my expected? If I apply everything you tell me, what kind of expected return until I've broken even on the cost of your course, and then when would it start making money?" Ask those kinds of questions. If you get a bunch of evasive answers, don't sign up. So, how to know where to spend money, ask questions, talk to people who have been through use the service or been through the seminar or whatever, and always have that extra 10% just for the mistakes that you know you're going to make at some point.
I think the last thing I want to add to that, because we covered it pretty well, is always trust your gut. It's
Yes.
right 90% of the time, which is why you only have to put aside 10% and not 50 if you're just
That's,
taking blind guesses. That's gambling, basically. And that's not a good business investment.
and trust your people's guts. If you're more than one person in your company, ask everybody their gut feel. Because people pick up on different things at different times and in different ways, and you want to have a composite picture whether this is going to help your team or not.
Very true. Very true. And on that, I think we're going to end today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow us. Let us know what you thought about today's episode, and take care.